That night, Chicago dropped to 10 below. June Holloway crouched at the foot of the elevated station stairs, restacking cardboard the wind had torn. The last train of the night screamed into the platform above her. 4 men came down the stairs. Long coats, polished shoes. The last one held an empty bottle. The one in front stopped when he saw her. "Oh." He waved a hand in front of his face. "Does anybody else smell that?" The other 3 laughed. The man with the bottle leaned against a steel column and began tapping the base of it against the metal. "Talk. Talk. Steady. Not fast. Not slow." June stood, picked up her backpack, turned to go. Then a hand caught the strap. The pack hit the wet concrete. The bootlace tied where the zipper had failed snapped clean. Everything spilled out: a roll of gauze, an old phone with a dark screen, and a small plastic bag folded into a neat square. Merrick Lowe picked up the bag before she could reach it. He did not snatch it. He peeled it open one fold at a time, slowly, like a man who already knew what was inside. In his hand was a plastic name badge, white face, blue letters. J. Holloway, RNICU, Hale Meridian Street, Ann. He read it aloud, every word of it. "A nurse." He held the badge up high, and all 4 of them broke into laughter. "You hearing this? She's a nurse." He glanced down at the pile on the ground. The phone lay there, one crack across the casing. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, then passed over it. That 1 second would go on to change 2 people's lives. "Give it back." June's voice was hoarse. She took 1 step forward. The tapping stopped. The man at the column straightened up, the bottle turning slowly in his palm, waiting to see whether she would take another step. She did not. Merrick let the badge fall into the meltwater. Then he set the toe of his shoe on it, pressed down, and turned his heel once. "Whoops," he said. "Sorry about that." The 4 of them walked away. June knelt. She did not cry. She had passed that stage long ago. She gathered each item, then put 2 fingers into the meltwater and lifted out the badge, wiped it on her sleeve. Once, then again. Then she breathed on the plastic and wiped it a 3rd time, until the letters came up under the yellow light, RN. 8 meters away, beneath the awning of the shuttered ticket window, a man stood without moving. Gray wool coat, unbuttoned, in 10 below. He had been there since before the train pulled in, and through the whole encounter he had not moved once. But he had been counting. 47 taps against the steel. Steady, measured never faster when they laughed, never slower when she spoke. Reese Callahan set his coffee cup down on the ledge, then he stepped out of the dark. If this story reached you, leave a like and subscribe to our channel to follow the rest of the journey. The sound of shoes against the concrete came slowly and evenly, without haste. June didn't look up. She had learned that looking up was a kind of invitation, and she had nothing left to offer anyone. She only tightened her fingers around the name badge in her palm and waited for the footsteps to pass. But they stopped. The man stood 2 paces away from her. His gray wool coat was unbuttoned, revealing the white shirt beneath it, the kind of white shirt worn only by men who had someone else wash and press their clothes. He didn't bend down to look at her. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't speak a single word of comfort. Instead, he turned toward the trash can at the foot of the stairs. The broken beer bottle lay on top, among several sheets of wet newspaper and a crushed paper cup. He reached inside without hesitation, without the slightest grimace, and lifted out a shard of glass as large as his palm. Then he turned it beneath the yellow station light, tilting his head as he studied the broken edge like a craftsman inspecting a cut. June watched him. She didn't understand what he was doing, and it was precisely because she didn't understand that she kept watching. The man placed the shard on the concrete step, carefully, broken side facing upward. Only then did he turn back toward her. "Do you know who those 4 men were?" His voice was calm. There was no anger in it, and no pity. It was the voice of someone gathering facts, exactly like the way doctors questioned patients about their pain in the darkest hours before dawn, when they already knew where the answer would lead. June looked up for the first time. She saw a clean-shaven face in its 30s and eyes that didn't blink. She waited for him to glance down at the flattened cardboard, at the backpack tied shut with a shoelace, at the wool gloves with holes in the fingers. People always looked down. That was how they decided what she was worth. He didn't look down. He looked straight into her eyes and waited. "No," she said. "Have you ever seen them before?" "No." "Are you sure?" She almost answered at once, then stopped. Because for the first time that night, She truly thought about it. 4 men in expensive wool coats and hand-stitched leather shoes, descending into a station in this neighborhood for the last train of the night. 3 of them hadn't said a word. They had only laughed along, and one of them had peeled open the plastic bag so slowly that she had seen every fold come apart. "I'm sure," she said. "I've never seen them before." The man gave one small nod, barely noticeable, as though her answer had settled neatly into an empty space he had already prepared for it. "Don't sleep here tonight." June blinked. "What?" "St. Brigid's Church on the corner of Adams still has beds. The warming station on Halsted Street is open until morning." He spoke as though reciting a list he had long since memorized. "Either place will do. Just not here." "Why?" He didn't answer. That was what sent a colder chill through her than the temperature 10 degrees below zero. It wasn't the warning itself, but the silence that followed it. People usually explained. They usually said the neighborhood was dangerous, or a storm was coming, or offered any reason that sounded decent enough. This man didn't waste a second on any of that. He had said what he came to say, and he assumed she was clever enough to understand. June opened her mouth to ask again, but he had already turned away. He climbed 2 steps, stopped, then bent down and picked up the shard of glass he had placed there. He slipped it into the pocket of his coat. He didn't explain that either. Then he walked away. Not quickly, not slowly. His gray wool coat remained unbuttoned in the bitter cold, as though the weather belonged to someone else. June stayed seated on the concrete, watching his figure move along the street, through the yellow light of a convenience store, through the pool of darkness between 2 street lamps, and finally disappear around the corner. She remained there for a long time, long enough for the cold to seep through the fabric of her pants and crawl all the way to her waist, long enough for her thoughts to circle through every possibility and find no answer. At last, she turned toward the window ledge of the closed ticket booth. The paper cup of coffee was still there. She rose, walked over, and touched the side of the cup. It was still warm, not hot, but warm, and that meant he hadn't taken a single sip during all the time he had stood beneath the shelter. June lifted the coffee with both hands. Then she pulled the backpack onto her shoulder, turned her back on the neatly arranged cardboard, and walked out of the station toward Halsted Street. The public warming station on Halsted Street was a 2-story red brick building that had once been a warehouse and now served as the place where 40 people slept through the winter. Its doors opened at twilight and closed at dawn, and between those 2 moments lay the only thing the city still gave away for free. June stepped inside with the rush of warm air spilling out from within, and the familiar smells received her. Damp fabric, candle wax, and hot metal rising from the old furnace. She went straight to the eastern corner of the room, where the only working electrical outlet on the entire first floor was located. People lined up for it in the evenings, but at this hour no one was still awake. June pulled the charger from the bottom of her backpack, its cord wrapped with tape in 3 places, and plugged in the phone with the cracked casing. She lowered herself onto the floor with her back against the wall, both hands wrapped around the paper cup of coffee that had gone completely cold, though she still hadn't taken a sip. The screen remained black for a long while. Then it lit up, casting a pale blue glow across her face, and the battery symbol appeared in the corner, not even 1/10 full. June looked around once before touching the screen. No one was watching her. She turned the phone on, moved past the home screen, and opened one particular photo folder. Not the first folder, not one with a name. She knew exactly where it was, exactly how many swipes it took to reach it, and she did it with her thumb without looking, the way someone opens a door inside their own home in the middle of the night. The first photograph appeared. She looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. She didn't enlarge it. She didn't swipe to the second picture. Then she pressed the power button. The screen went dark, and she unplugged the charger even though the battery had gained only a little. She slipped the phone into a tear in the lining of her coat, close against her ribs, where even if someone stole her backpack again, they still wouldn't take anything that mattered. Then she sat perfectly still, her hands resting on her knees, and breathed out very slowly. In the row of beds near the window, a man began to cough. The cough was dry and short, repeating in sets of 3 before stopping, then coming again in another set of 3. June could hear it from where she sat, about 15 paces away. She didn't turn her head. She only sat there and counted. She counted the distance between each cluster of coughs, counted the number of breaths he took during every silence, and without looking, she knew which side he was lying on, knew his head was lower than his chest, Knew the rolled pillow beneath his neck was making everything worse instead of better. She knew those things the way a person knows their own name. She waited. She waited until the woman in the bed across from him turned her back, waited until the two men playing cards at the far end of the room gathered the deck and switched off their flashlight. Only then did she stand. She moved behind the row of beds instead of taking the center aisle, and when she reached the coughing man, she turned her back to the entire room. She bent down low. She whispered something into his ear, softly enough that he only nodded. Then she slid one hand beneath his shoulder and used the other to hold the pillow, and in less than 10 counts, she had shifted him toward the edge of the bed closest to the furnace, raised his upper body, folded the pillow into a completely different shape, and wedged it into the proper place beneath his back. She did everything without wasting a single movement, quickly, decisively, keeping her face hidden from beginning to end. The coughing grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. The man managed one deep breath and drifted to sleep. June straightened, looked around once more, then made her way back to her place in the corner, her heart beating faster than it should have for something so small. She sat down, pulled her collar higher, and closed her eyes. A little while later, slippers scraped softly across the concrete floor, and a bowl of hot soup was set beside her, steam rising into the cold air. Gus Reynolds sat down on a plastic chair, a short distance away, both hands braced on his knees, the little finger missing from his left hand. He didn't ask what she had just done. He didn't look toward the row of beds near the window. He only spoke in a rough, steady voice, as though greeting an old neighbor. "Eat, June." She opened her eyes. She sat motionless for a long time, while the bowl of soup continued to steam between them. Then she lowered her head and picked it up with both hands. And it took her a little longer before she could bring it to her lips, because over the past 6 months, she had forgotten what it felt like to hear someone call her by her name. Morning on the 42nd floor of the building on Wacker Drive began with sunlight slanting through the glass, spilling across the walnut desk, and revealing every grain of dust suspended in the air. From where Reese Callahan sat, the entire West Loop stretched below him like a map someone had drawn in concrete, and within that map were 3,200 apartments bearing the names of 7 different companies, and all 7 of those companies led back to the same signature. The door opened. Warren Hobb, the Callahan family's attorney for 26 years, entered with a document case held against his chest and placed a thick stack of files on the desk. He didn't offer a greeting. People here had stopped bothering with that part a long time ago. Reese drew a pen from his breast pocket. The first file concerned a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, 4 months behind on rent. He signed it. The second concerned a man who worked the night shift at a distribution warehouse, 3.5 months behind, already served with a final notice. He signed it. The third was a laundromat on the ground floor that had been closed since autumn, though the owner was still living in the apartment above it. He signed it. He signed the 4th and 5th files in succession, without finishing the first page of either one. Warren Hobb stood beside him, turning each sheet, and the whisper of paper was the only sound in the room. The 6th file included a photograph of the building's facade, 2 children's bicycles parked in the hallway, and a withered plant on the windowsill. Reese looked at the photograph for exactly 1 moment before signing his name beneath it. The pen didn't tremble or pause, and the darkness of the ink on the 6th document was identical to the first. That was what Warren Hobb had observed for the past 11 months, and still hadn't grown accustomed to. That this man signed an eviction order in exactly the same way he signed a restaurant bill. Hobb turned to the 7th file. It concerned a duplex south of Ashland Street, 4 months in arrears, its final notice already overdue. In the upper right corner was a yellow note in Hobb's own handwriting, small and slanted. Family of 4. An 82-year-old grandmother discharged from the hospital last week, still waiting for the next round of treatment. Reese read the line. The tip of his pen touched the paper but didn't move. 42 floors below, a fire engine traveled along the avenue with its siren wailing, the sound rising faintly through the glass before fading away. Reese lifted the pen, turned its tip downward, and drew a single line across the entire 7th file. Then he pushed it aside. He didn't explain. He didn't give a reason. He didn't look at Hobb to see how the other man reacted. He only said in a level voice, "Send these 6 out this morning." Hobb gathered the files, and as he did, he asked nothing about the 7th, because 26 years of working for the Callahan family had taught him that questions were the most expensive things in this room. But he didn't leave at once. He stepped into the hallway, and returned with a square cardboard box, its tape yellowed along the edges, and set it on the walnut desk. "Your father's things," Hobb said. "They've been in storage in the basement since the funeral. The facility is being cleared out, and they asked me what should be done with them." Reese looked at the box but didn't reach for it. "Did you open it?" "No," Hobb said. "It wasn't my place." Reese set down the pen. He pulled the box closer, split the tape with his thumb, and lifted the lid. There wasn't much inside. A pair of reading glasses with one broken arm, a wristwatch that had stopped, a small photograph of the first building Ambrose Callahan had bought on the south side when he was 31 years old, and beneath everything else, resting against the bottom of the box, was a brown leather notebook worn smooth at all four corners, its spine cracked, its leather tie stretched loose from being opened and closed too many times across too many years. Reese looked at it. He looked longer than anyone needed to recognize a notebook. The morning sunlight crept slowly across the desk and reached the edge of the box, and during that time, no one in the room said a word. Then Reese closed the lid. He did it with one hand, without haste, pressing the two cardboard edges down until they fit tightly together. He opened the lowest drawer of his desk, the deepest one, the drawer he hadn't used once since moving into that office, and placed the box inside. Warren Hobb cleared his throat. "You don't want to look through it? I thought there might be papers in there." Reese pushed the drawer closed. The runners gave one dry scrape, then fell silent. "I already know what's in it," he said. Then he turned his chair toward the glass, looked down over the West Loop, and said nothing more until Hobb had left the room. The warehouse stood where the Chicago River bent westward, one of a row of old steel buildings the Callahan family had purchased back when the port was still operating and had never sold. Inside, it was empty, cavernous, and almost as cold as the air outside, with only a single industrial light hanging from the ceiling and casting its glow over a folding table and two chairs. The man seated in the chair across from Reese was named Franklin Doyle. He had kept the books for the organization's transportation companies for 9 years, owned a plaid coat he wore in every season, and had a habit of turning his wedding ring whenever he was nervous. At that moment, he was turning it. Reese sat opposite him, his gray wool coat draped over the back of the chair, both hands resting on the folding table. 3 other men stood along the wall behind him, far enough away not to hear clearly, close enough to be present. None of them held anything. None of them approached Franklin Doyle. The room was so quiet that the river could be heard striking the embankment outside. "I'm not going to ask whether you did it," Reese said. "I already know. I'm not going to ask how much you took either. I know that too." Franklin Doyle opened his mouth. Reese raised 2 fingers from the tabletop. Only 2, and Doyle fell silent. "I'm asking you one thing. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" The man across the table lowered his eyes. He breathed out, and his breath gathered into mist within the light beneath the hanging lamp. "I thought you would find out," he said. "I thought you would find out later." "Yeah," Reese said. "Everyone thinks that." He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, opened it, smoothed it flat with the back of his hand, and turned it around for Doyle to read. It was a cleanly printed document with the logo of a Delaware trust company in the upper corner. Reese didn't read it aloud for him. He let the other man read it himself, and he remained still the entire time, never urging him on, never tapping his fingers, never looking at his watch. By the time Franklin Doyle finished the first page, his hand had stopped turning the ring. Halfway through the second, the paper began to tremble. "This is an educational trust," Reese said, when the man finally looked up. "It will cover all of her graduate tuition in Ann Arbor, the rest of the program, and doctoral studies if she continues. It includes living expenses. It includes insurance. The trust is managed by a third party. My name isn't on it, yours isn't on it, and no one will be able to trace it. She'll receive a letter telling her she has been awarded a scholarship from a real organization that has existed for 30 years. She'll believe it. She'll have no reason not to." Doyle stared at the paper. "The last page is your part," Reese said. "You leave Chicago this week. You don't come back. You don't call, write, send messages, or appear anywhere she might be. Not once. Not ever." Franklin Doyle turned to the final page and read it very slowly. Then he placed the document on the table and straightened in his chair. "Mr. Callahan," he said, "I'm begging you to give me another way. There isn't another way. Anyway, take everything I have. The house, the car, the accounts, I'll sign it all over tonight. Make me work without pay for the rest of my life, and I'll do it. You want me gone from the city? I'll go. I'll leave right now. I don't need to pack anything." He stopped, and his voice broke in the middle of the next sentence. "But don't take that. She's my daughter." Reese didn't change his posture. He didn't lean forward, lower his voice, or make any of the gestures people made when they wanted to appear as though they were considering something. "She'll have a future," he said. "You won't be part of it. That's the price." Then he took the pen from his pocket, placed it on the folding table, and pushed it across. The pen rolled once over the metal surface before coming to rest against Franklin Doyle's finger. He sat staring at it for a long time. The light above them swayed gently in the draft, slipping through the gap beneath the rolling door, and the shadows of the two men shifted back and forth across the table. At last, Doyle picked up the pen. He signed the final line, his signature crooked and nothing like the one he had used throughout 9 years of bookkeeping. Then he set the pen down and remained still, both palms resting flat on the table. Reese took the paper, folded it into quarters, and slipped it into his breast pocket. He stood and settled the gray wool coat over his shoulders. One of the 3 men by the wall stepped forward, and as Reese passed him, the man said quietly, "The old man would have done exactly the same thing." Reese didn't stop. He didn't look up. "My father did do this," he said. "He just never bothered to stay and watch them sign." Then he stepped beyond the circle of light, and the sound of the rolling door rising behind him was like one long sigh from the steel building. Late afternoon had settled over the south side, and the sky had turned the color of lead long before the sun had a chance to set. June walked north along 63rd Street, walking because it kept her warmer than sitting still, and because the warming station hadn't opened yet. She passed a closed shoe repair shop, a thrift store with 3 coats hanging in the display window, and a diner with 2 people seated inside. Then she passed a narrow storefront painted pale blue, with a wooden door, a sign in simple block letters, and a smaller line above it, stating that no fees were charged. She had walked past this place many times. She had never stopped. That afternoon, she stopped. The window was fogged from the inside, and through the clear patch that remained in the center, she could see a small waiting room with 6 orange plastic chairs and a worn doormat. On the wall to the right was a hand-painted height chart shaped like a tree, with green leaves and horizontal marks crowded all the way from the bottom to the top. A little boy stood with his back against it, his heels pressed to the wall, his chin lifted, trying to stand as straight as children always do when they want to seem taller. The nurse placed a small wooden bar on top of his head, held it steady, then stepped back. The boy spun around to look, and when he saw that the new pencil mark stood clearly above the one from the year before, he jumped and threw both hands into the air. His mother, seated in one of the orange plastic chairs, clapped. The nurse smiled, bent down to record the number in the notebook on the table, then drew another pencil line to make certain, and wrote the date beside it. The boy ran back to his mother, speaking very quickly and pointing toward the wall. His mother nodded and kept nodding. Outside, June stood perfectly still. Her breath gathered against the glass and blurred the clear patch even more, and she had to tilt her head to one side to keep watching. She watched the way the nurse held the notebook. She watched the way the nurse rested the pencil between 2 fingers while bending down to write, the same position June's own hand had taken for 6 years, though no one had ever taught her. It had simply come after several thousand repetitions. She looked at the name badge pinned to the nurse's chest, too far away for her to read, but she didn't need to read it to know what was written there. June lifted her hand. She placed her palm against the glass, directly beneath the tree-shaped height chart, and held it there. The glass was painfully cold through the tear in the index finger of her wool glove. Inside, the little boy ran once more around his mother's chair. Outside, no one passed along the sidewalk. June lowered her hand. A faint print remained on the glass, and she watched it slowly disappear over the course of several breaths, until the fog covered the window again, and nothing remained. Then she pulled the collar of her coat up over her chin, turned away, and continued walking north. Reese Callahan didn't need anyone to investigate that name. He had read it with his own eyes beneath the station light, read the title beneath it and the name of the hospital printed below that, and those 4 letters had remained in his mind ever since that night. What he needed to know was something else, and he said it aloud when Warren Hobb entered his office on Tuesday morning. Why now? The woman had lost her professional license 2 years earlier. 2 years was long enough for a name to sink completely out of sight. long enough for no one to remember it, long enough for her to become what this city called a number in its winter statistics. People didn't send 4 men in expensive coats to look for a name that had been buried for 2 years. They only did that when the name had surfaced again. Hobb brought the answer back 4 days later in a file so thin that Reese thought he had arrived empty-handed. 3 weeks before the night at Halstead Station, June Holloway had mailed a handwritten petition to the Illinois State Medical Board, a request to reopen her disciplinary case. 4 pages, written in ballpoint pen, sent from a public mailbox at the Jackson Street Post Office, with no attorney listed and no filing fee enclosed because she didn't have the money to pay it. The board denied the petition within 2 business days. The reason recorded in the minutes was that there was no new evidence sufficient to justify reconsideration. Case closed. The response had been mailed to the post office box, and according to the postal tracking record, it was still sitting there, unclaimed. So the petition was dead from the beginning, Hobb said. There was nowhere for it to go. Reese didn't answer. He turned to the second page of the file, where Hobb had printed the board's intake procedure, and read it very slowly, 1 line at a time, the same way he read a land lease. Under Section 7, there was a short sentence written in the dry administrative language no one ever bothered to read. Every complaint naming a medical facility was automatically forwarded to that facility's legal department to ensure its right to notice and response. The copy was sent within 24 hours of the complaint being entered into the system, regardless of whether the petition was accepted for review. Reese read the sentence twice. Then he placed his finger on it. The petition died, he said, but it touched the system first. Hobb remained silent for a moment. Then he sat in the chair across from the desk, something he rarely did. You mean the other side knew before the board had time to reject it? The other side knew before she did, Reese said. She still hasn't received the response. They had a copy sitting on their desk 2 days earlier. He closed the file and set it aside. Then he opened the second drawer of his desk and removed another set of documents, something he had ordered prepared in the fall and hadn't touched since. It was the planning file for a parcel on Halstead Street, land whose development rights the city had auctioned in November, land currently occupied by a 2-story red brick building used as a public warming station. Reese had taken an interest in it because 2 of his family's rental buildings stood directly beside it, and whatever was built there would alter property values within a 3-block radius. He opened the file to the page, naming the successful developer. He stared at the name for a long time. Then he pulled Hobb's thin file closer, opened it to the page naming the medical facility identified in the handwritten petition, and placed the 2 sheets side by side on the walnut desk. Hale Meridian Health. The same name, printed in the same typeface, on 2 documents that had no apparent connection to each other. The morning sunlight had crossed the entire desk and reached the edge of the files. Warren Hobb stood and walked around behind Reese to see more clearly, and when he understood what he was looking at, he said nothing for a long while. So those 4 men, Hobb finally said. They didn't go there to cause trouble. No, Reese said. They went to see whether she was still carrying anything. He tapped 2 fingers once against the edge of the desk, then stopped. And they left empty-handed, so they'll come back. The storm came from the northwest, and the Weather Service had warned of it 2 days in advance. That afternoon, Gus Reynolds stood at the entrance of the warming station and did what he always did before every major storm. He called the parish van to take all the families with young children to St. Bridget's Church on the corner of Adams Street, where there was a diesel backup generator and a basement that stayed warm throughout the year. He finished everything before darkness fell, counted every person as they boarded, closed the van door, waved, then went back inside and wrote on the board, hanging by the entrance, that only adults would remain at the station that night. 40 people stayed behind. The storm struck the city a few hours later, and by midnight, the lane markings on Halstead Street had vanished beneath a white current of snow, sweeping sideways through the streetlights. The station's generator failed when the wind was at its strongest. It didn't shut down all at once. It weakened gradually, the ceiling lights turning yellow, then burning red, then going completely dark, and with them went the low mechanical hum of the central furnace fan. In the darkness came the sound of people sitting up, someone stumbling into a chair, and a woman asking what had happened. Gus switched on a handheld flashlight and began walking down the center aisle, calling out for everyone to remain seated while he went outside to inspect the generator. June was already on her feet before he had crossed half the room. She didn't think. That was what she realized later, that she hadn't taken even a second to consider anything. that there had been no pause between the moment the lights went out and the moment her feet touched the floor. 6 years in intensive care had placed something inside her that started running on its own whenever the light disappeared. And that night, it ran. She went straight to the coal stove at the front of the room, the only thing still holding heat, and began moving people toward it. First, she called the man with the dry cough, whose pillow she had adjusted several nights earlier. Then a silver-haired woman who wheezed whenever she turned over. Then an old man whose strained breathing she had heard through 2 blankets since the week before. She arranged them in a curved line close to the stove, with their heads raised above their chests, and she spoke one short sentence to each of them so they would know they had been seen. Then she went looking for the 3 people she knew had diabetes, 2 of whom took injections every evening, and she gave them the remaining bread and cartons of milk from the cupboard before she gave anything to the healthy people who were hungry. Someone complained. She didn't stop to explain. Then she moved along the row of beds by the windows, the coldest part of the room, and gathered blankets from the empty beds in the center, laying extra covers over everyone older than 70, 2 layers for each person, tucking the edges beneath their backs in a fold the others could see, but didn't know how to name. She did all of it before Gus had even finished opening the generator casing in the backyard. She did it without turning her back, without hiding her face, without looking around to see whether anyone was watching. She forgot about that. By the time she remembered, it was too late, and she froze in the middle of the aisle with a stack of blankets still held in her arms, her heart pounding, and looked around the dark room to find 40 faces turned toward her. No one said anything. The silver-haired woman near the stove thanked her. At that exact moment, the front door opened. The wind drove a cloud of snow inside, and a tall figure appeared in the doorway, wearing a gray wool coat, his shoulders and hair covered in white. Reese Callahan stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and stood there taking in the entire darkened room. He didn't ask who was in charge. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't say a single word to June, and she said nothing to him. He only looked at the way 40 people had been arranged in the darkness, at the curved line gathered around the stove, at the blankets in her arms, and then he took his phone from his pocket. He moved to the corner of the room to make a call, turning his back, and the conversation lasted less than a minute. Through the wind, June caught only a few scattered words, an address, a number, and one short sentence saying he didn't care what time it was. Then he put the phone back into his pocket and went out to the backyard, where Gus was struggling with the generator beneath the beam of his flashlight. Reese took off his wool coat, draped it over the fence, and knelt beside the old man in nothing but a white shirt in the middle of the storm. For the rest of the night, the 2 men remained outside, while 40 people stayed inside, and June moved from one end of the room to the other, checking each person once, then a second time, then a third. At one point, she carried 2 cups of hot water out into the yard. She set them on the steps without saying anything, and went back inside. Reese picked up one of the cups without turning around. 3 trucks arrived before dawn. They traveled in a line along Halstead Street, their headlights cutting through the curtain of snow, and the men unloaded 2 industrial generators wrapped in tarps, along with 4 drums of fuel. The ceiling lights came back on just as the eastern sky began to turn pale gray. The entire room flooded with light at once, and a cheer rose from the people inside. Reese was already gone. No one had seen when he left. That morning, while everyone lined up for coffee, Gus walked over to where June sat in the corner and handed her a sheet of paper folded in half. It was an invoice from the generator rental company, printed on a dot matrix printer, listing 2 generators, 4 drums of fuel, an emergency after-hours delivery charge, and a service fee for installation under severe weather conditions. At the bottom was a line stamped in red ink stating that the balance had been paid in full. The space for the payer's name had been left blank. June stared at the paper for a long time. Gus said nothing. He only stood there with both hands in his pockets, looking out the window where the snow had stopped falling. 3 nights after the storm, the warming station had returned to its old rhythm, the 2 new generators running quietly in the backyard and the ceiling lights glowing steadily through the night. Gus Reynolds made one final round as he always did, dimming some of the lights, checking the door latch, then lowering himself into his plastic chair at the front of the room. He sat there for a while. Then he lifted a hand to rub his left shoulder, shifted his position, and rubbed it again. June saw it from where she sat in the corner. She saw it before he even realized something was wrong, because over 6 years, she had learned that the human body gave its warnings through small movements before it gave them through anything dramatic. She stood up. She had taken only 3 steps when Gus slipped from the chair onto the concrete floor. Someone screamed. All the lights came back on. People rushed forward and back. One man dropped to his knees and shook the old man's shoulder while calling his name. A woman ran to find blankets. Someone called emergency services and repeated the address into the phone again and again. The answer came through the speaker loudly enough for the entire room to hear that an ambulance was on the way, but Halsted Street was blocked by piled snow, and the estimated arrival time was more than half an hour. The room fell completely silent after that. June stood exactly 4 paces from Gus. She knew precisely what to do. She knew it the way a person knows the road home, from where to place her hands, to how deep to press, to how many beats in a minute. Knew even the thing no book ever taught, that if they waited 4 more minutes, everything afterward would be nothing but ceremony. But she knew something else, too. She knew the order suspending her license stated in language that allowed no misunderstanding that anyone whose professional license had been suspended was forbidden from performing any medical intervention in a professional capacity, and that violating that order would give the board grounds to close her case permanently, not suspend it again but revoke it entirely, never reopen it, never grant another hearing for the rest of her life. For 2 years she had survived on one thing alone, not on the food at the warming station, not on the sheets of cardboard beneath the station stairs, but on the thought that one day that door might open again. The petition she had mailed 3 weeks earlier was that hope. The photographs stored inside the cracked phone hidden in the lining of her coat were that hope. The name badge she had wiped 3 times beneath the station light was that hope. June looked around the room, and she saw it. In the second row of beds, a man was standing with both hands holding a phone at eye level, the screen glowing, the camera pointed directly at the concrete floor where Gus lay. He wasn't recording to hurt anyone. He was recording because people recorded everything now. But June saw the tiny red dot in the corner of the screen, and for one brief moment, she understood everything that was about to happen to her life. That video would remain. It would stay on that man's phone, then appear online, then enter a file. Someone would recognize her. Someone at Hale Meridian would see it. And everything she had managed to preserve after 2 years would disappear in less time than the storm had lasted. She knew all of that. She knew it before she moved. Then she stepped forward. She knelt on the cold concrete beside the old man who had spoken her name correctly on the night she believed she no longer had one. She moved the man, shaking his shoulder aside with one short command. She placed both hands down, one over the other, fingers interlocked, elbows straight, shoulders directly above her hands, and she began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her voice was steady, not loud, not trembling, the rhythm as precise as a clock that had run for 6 years without losing a single second. 5, 6, 7, 8. The entire room drew back into a circle around her. No one spoke. The silver-haired woman near the stove raised both hands to cover her mouth. The man holding the phone didn't lower it. The red dot remained lit. 15, 16, 17. Her hands didn't shift even an inch. They were the only thing in that room that didn't change. Everything else was moving, the ceiling lights trembling slightly with the wind outside the door, the breath of 40 people gathering into mist, snow still piling across Halsted Street, and the ambulance still somewhere on the far side of the city. But those 2 hands held their position, and that count held its pace. 28, 29, 30. She stopped for exactly 1 moment, did what had to be done, then returned and began counting from the beginning. 1, 2, 3. Someone started counting with her, then 2 people. Then the whole room counted beside her. Rough voices, trembling voices. 40 people standing in a circle inside a red brick building on Halsted Street, counting aloud in the same rhythm in the middle of the night. June didn't hear them. She heard only her own count and the pounding of blood in her ears. Sweat ran along her temple even though the room was cold. Her arms began to tremble during the 4th cycle, and she didn't stop. During the 6th, someone knelt beside her and asked to take over, and she shook her head, because changing hands meant losing the rhythm, and the rhythm was the only thing left. Outside, very far away, a siren rose through the curtain of snow. It was still many blocks away. June bent lower, tightened her hands, and kept counting. Cook County Hospital stood on the far side of the city, and the 4th-floor corridor carried a smell June knew better than the scent of any home she had ever lived in. She sat on a plastic chair outside the room throughout the first morning, both hands resting on her knees, and she didn't go inside because she wasn't family. and there was no space on Gus Reynolds's paperwork where her name could be written. By the afternoon of the second day, a young nurse came to the doorway and called her in, saying the old man had been asking for her again and again. Gus lay with his head turned toward the door as though he had been waiting a long time. He looked much smaller than the man who always sat in the plastic chair at the front of the warming station. He looked at her and smiled, and the first thing he said, in a voice rougher than usual, was that he had heard the whole room had counted aloud with her, and he was sorry he hadn't been able to hear it. June sat on the edge of the bed. She was about to say something about how he needed to rest. He raised one hand to stop her, then pointed toward the cloth bag beneath the foot of the bed, the one someone from the warming station had brought the day before. "Get the thing inside for me," he said. June pulled the bag up and opened it. There wasn't much inside: a sweater, a box of medicine, a ring of keys, and at the bottom, a gray hardbound ledger, the old kind sold in office supply stores 20 years earlier. Its cover had faded to the color of ash, all four corners worn round, its spine repaired with cloth tape in 3 different places, each patch a different color, applied during 3 different periods in the life of the same book. June lifted it, and it was heavier than she expected. "Open it," Gus said. She opened it. The first page had 3 columns drawn with a ruler in blue ballpoint ink, filled with the slow, slanted handwriting of someone who wasn't accustomed to writing very much. The first column held dates, the second held names, the third was either empty or contained a few brief words. The first line bore a date in November 14 years earlier, and beside it was a man's name, and in the third column were 3 words: "Worked as carpenter." June turned to the second page, then the third. Then she began turning them faster, the pages passing beneath her fingers one after another, hundreds of lines, the ink changing from blue to black and back to blue again, the handwriting shifting with the years, careful in some places, hurried in others, with certain lines crossed out and rewritten beneath. The third column held all kinds of things: used to drive trucks, played the trombone, has 2 daughters in Ohio, made the best stew I ever ate, afraid of dogs but won't admit it. She turned to the last page with writing and stopped. On the second to last line, dated that December, was her name, June Holloway, and in the third column, 4 words: "Knows how to heal people." June sat motionless for a long time. She didn't turn another page. 412, Gus said. "I counted them again in September. A few people were written down twice because I forgot, so I subtracted them." He took a breath and had to rest before he could continue. "You take it." June shook her head. She meant to give it back, meant to say he would return to the warming station in a few days and would need it to keep writing, but she couldn't make a single word come out. "People pass through my place, and then they keep going," he said. "No one asks their names. At the hospital, they ask for an insurance number. At the benefits office, they ask for a case number. At the morgue, sometimes no one asks anything at all." He turned his head toward the window, where the lead-colored December sky was slowly darkening. "I write them down so someone will remember they once existed." He died 3 days later. It happened in the morning, quietly, and they called the warming station instead of anyone else, because his records also had no space where a relative's name could be written. The funeral was held behind St. Bridget's Church, the same place he had always called the van to take people whenever a storm came. There was no snow, but the wind cut through the skin. 7 people attended. June. 3 people from the warming station, the priest, the cemetery attendant, and an elderly woman in a red coat whom no one knew, who stood crying from beginning to end and disappeared before anyone could ask who she was. The priest read a short passage. There was no eulogy, because no one had been assigned to write one. June stood holding the hardbound ledger in both hands, pressing it against her chest beneath her coat, and she didn't speak a single word. At the far end of the yard, about 20 paces from the grave, close to the iron fence, a man stood alone. His gray wool coat was unbuttoned. He remained there throughout the service, never coming closer, never lowering his head during the prayer, simply standing and watching. When the others began to drift away, he left as well. None of the 6 people who remained knew who he was, and no one asked. Reese Callahan returned to his office after most of the building's lights had been turned off, and the 42nd floor was lit only by the glow rising from the city below. He didn't switch on the ceiling lights. He hung his gray wool coat over the back of the chair, sat down, and remained there in silence for a long time, looking into the darkness beyond the glass. He was thinking about a gray, hardbound ledger that a woman had held against her chest throughout that afternoon behind the church, pressing it tightly beneath her coat, as though she feared the wind might carry it away. He didn't know what was inside it. He only knew she held it the way people held the last thing they had left. Then he opened the bottom drawer. The cardboard box was still where he had placed it several weeks earlier, the cut edge of the tape still curling upward. He lifted it out, set it on the walnut desk, and sat looking at it for a while longer. He knew he was going to open it. He had known that since the moment he stood by the iron fence at the far end of the churchyard. What he didn't know was why he had waited 11 months, and the answer was irritatingly simple. He had already known what was inside. Ambrose Callahan had built everything Reese was sitting inside, and he had built it by forcing people out of their homes in the middle of Chicago winters, year after year. 3,200 apartments didn't appear out of nowhere. Reese had grown up in the house in Kenilworth, listening to phone calls drift out from his father's study, pleading voices at the other end of the line, and Ambrose answering in clipped sentences before hanging up. He had believed the notebook was the record of a man like that, a list of the people he had driven away, something used for counting. He opened the lid, moved the broken reading glasses and the stopped wristwatch aside, and lifted out the leather-bound notebook. The leather tie had stretched so loose that it slipped free with the slightest pull. He opened to the first page. There were 4 columns. The first held dates, the second held names, the third held the name of a hospital, the fourth held an amount of money. The first line bore a date in March 21 years earlier, a man's name, Mercy Hospital, and a number. Reese looked at it and didn't understand. He turned to the second page, thinking it was a record of debts, that his father had lent people money for hospital bills and collected it later with interest, and that would have fit everything Reese knew. But there was no column for repayment dates, no column for interest rates, no notation showing how much had been collected. He turned 3 more pages before he found something else. In the left margin beside one line, written smaller than the rest, were 4 words. Do not reveal name. He stopped on that line for a long time. Then he kept turning, began searching for the same note on the pages that followed, and found it everywhere, repeated over and over, year after year, sometimes written in full, sometimes reduced to 3 letters, sometimes marked only by a small check in the margin that only the writer would have understood. Do not reveal name. Do not reveal name. Do not reveal name. Reese turned the pages faster. They passed beneath his fingers as the ink changed with the years. Blue, then black, then blue again. His father's handwriting changing over time, the strokes growing firmer and then gradually beginning to tremble. There were names he recognized. A man who had once worked as a security guard in the building on Ashland Street. A woman who had cleaned the company's old offices when Reese was still in high school. A man Reese remembered clearly because Ambrose had repossessed his apartment during the summer Reese was 17, and that name appeared halfway through the notebook, dated September of that same year. Rush Hospital, an amount larger than most of the others, and in the left margin were the same 4 familiar words. Reese set the notebook down on the desk. He sat upright, his hands resting on his thighs, and looked through the glass at the lights of the West Loop spread below, at the city he had believed he understood. He remained that way for a long time before picking up the notebook again. He didn't begin at the front. He turned directly to the end, to the pages where the ink was still fresh, to the months before his father lay on the 7th floor of Northwestern Hospital, while Reese was on the other side of the world and didn't return in time. The final entries were written in a trembling hand, the letters larger than before, some lines slipping away from the ruled spaces. The last page contained only 3 entries. The first 2 were complete, each with a name, a hospital, and an amount, finished and fully recorded. The third had no hospital, no amount, only a date, a name, and 3 words added afterward in handwriting almost too faint to read. Holloway, J., didn't make it. Reese didn't move. The city lights flickered below. Somewhere far away, an ambulance siren traveled down the avenue and faded. He sat in the darkness of the room on the 42nd floor, the notebook open across his knees, and didn't speak a single word. That night, June sat in her familiar corner of the warming station, the gray, hardbound ledger resting on her lap, and she hadn't opened it once since leaving the churchyard. She plugged the cracked phone into the shared outlet, and this time she didn't unplug it when the battery gained only a little. She let it charge. She waited for more than an hour until the battery symbol was completely full, and while she waited, she thought about what Gus had written in the 3rd column beside every name. the small fragments he had gathered from people and kept. She thought about how he had sat there writing those lines for 14 years without anyone knowing, without anyone asking, and without ever telling anyone himself. Then she turned on the phone. She opened the photo folder, the nameless one hidden in a place only she knew how to reach. And this time she didn't look for 2 seconds and switched the phone off. For the past 2 years, every time she opened it, she had been forced to live through everything again, and she had taught herself to glance only long enough to know it was still there before turning it off at once, the way someone touches a scar without daring to look down. That night, she looked. The first image was a screenshot of a physician order log, the date in the upper corner and the record number at the bottom. The second was the same, with a different date, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th. 11 images in all, 11 records, 11 people whose cases she had followed through every shift, recording every number before all of them disappeared from the system 3 weeks later. She looked through all 11 images slowly, one by one, and she allowed it to hurt. The 12th image was different. It was a photograph of the disciplinary ruling she had received by mail one March afternoon 2 years earlier. The document she had read exactly once, photographed, then placed in an envelope and never opened again. She knew its contents by heart, the opening paragraph stating that the board had reviewed the matter. The middle paragraph describing the alleged medication dosage error during the shift on February 14th, a shift she hadn't worked. The final paragraph imposing an indefinite suspension of her professional license and adding her name to the National Registry. She had recited those 3 paragraphs in her mind thousands of times over the past 2 years. But she had never enlarged the bottom of the page. People didn't enlarge the signature section. The signature section was invisible, the place the eye passed over, the period at the end, rather than the substance itself. June placed 2 fingers on the screen and spread them apart. The image enlarged, breaking into pixels and blurring around the edges. She dragged the frame down to the bottom of the document, and there were 2 lines. The upper line held the signature of the board chair, stamped and accompanied by a typed name beneath it. The lower line on the right was reserved for the confirming signature of the facility's direct supervisor, something the procedure required before a disciplinary action could take effect. June dragged the frame to the right and enlarged it another step. The signature there was so familiar that she recognized it before she could read the typed words below. The backward hook in the first letter. The long tail that curved upward at the end. She had seen that signature at the bottom of thousands of physician orders during 6 years of work. She had seen it at the end of the recommendation letter she used when applying to the intensive care unit at 21 years old. She had seen it on the card attached to the small potted plant placed beside her hospital bed when she had her appendix removed during her 2nd year on the job. Beneath it, typed clearly and impossible to misread, were the words, Margaret Osler, Director of Intensive Care, Hale Meridian St. Anne. June didn't turn off the phone. She sat motionless with the screen still glowing in her palm until it dimmed on its own. Then she slipped the phone into the lining of her coat, stood, tucked the hardbound ledger beneath her arm, and walked toward the door. The night attendant asked where she was going at that hour. She didn't answer. She walked north along Halsted Street, past the elevated train station, past the closed shoe repair shop, past the yellow light of a convenience store that stayed open all night. She crossed the bridge over the south branch of the river, continued into the loop, and kept walking without turning, without stopping, without looking at the street names. Somewhere near Michigan Avenue, she sat on the steps of a closed building, holding the ledger against herself, and remained there until both feet went numb. Then she stood and kept walking. Dawn came while she was standing by the lake. The water was the color of lead, the wind cut across her face, and in the east, a thin line of light was slowly opening along the horizon. June stood watching it for a long time, and during 6 years in medicine, she had learned that some wounds couldn't be stitched closed from the outside. They could only be left alone while one waited to see whether they would heal on their own or destroy themselves. Reese Callahan gave the order on Thursday morning, briefly, during a call that lasted less than a minute from the backseat of a car traveling along Wacker Drive. He didn't use any specific words. He only said a name, said he wanted to know where Prescott Hale went every Tuesday, who drove for him, which door of the house in Winnetka had no camera, and that he wanted the information before the weekend. The person on the other end didn't ask a single question. That was how things had been done for the past 11 months, and for the 20 years before that. The news reached June the following afternoon through someone at the warming station, whose brother worked as a night security guard in one of the Callahan buildings. and the man repeated it as though he were sharing an interesting story, rather than giving her a warning. The moment June finished listening, she stood and left. She walked the entire distance from Halsted Street to the Loop without stopping once, and by the time she reached the base of the building on Wacker Drive, darkness had fallen and snow had begun to fall again. She didn't enter through the front doors. She knew what she looked like, and she knew what the security guards would do. She went around to the back, down the ramp leading into the underground garage, and stood beneath the bleached white fluorescent lights among rows of cars, beside a numbered concrete pillar, and waited. She waited for more than 2 hours. The black car descended the ramp shortly before 9 o'clock, and stopped several yards from where she stood. The rear door opened. Reese stepped out with his gray wool coat draped over one arm, and he stopped when he saw her. The driver got out as well. Reese raised one finger, and the man returned to the car. "What are you planning to do to Prescott Hale?" June said. It wasn't a question. Reese looked at her. He didn't ask where she had heard it, didn't deny anything, didn't pretend not to understand. "Go back. It's cold here. What are you planning to do to him? That isn't your concern." "It is my concern." She stepped forward once, and her voice carried through the concrete emptiness, echoing beneath the low ceiling. "I've slept on the streets for 2 years because of that file. I've picked through leftover food behind restaurants. I've stood outside a clinic and been afraid to walk in because I no longer had the right to enter. If this isn't my concern, then I don't know what in this world could possibly be." Reese didn't answer. "Go ahead," she said. "Do whatever it is you're planning to do. And then what? He disappears, or he has an accident, or whatever else men like you arrange. Tomorrow morning, I'll still wake up on the concrete floor of the warming station. My name will still be on the National Registry. I'll still be forbidden from touching a patient until the day I die. You do that, and I'll still be the homeless woman from Halsted Station." She stopped. Somewhere overhead, the garage ventilation system hummed steadily. "Do you want to help me, or do you want to defeat him?" Reese stood motionless. He didn't take his eyes off her, and beneath the stark white fluorescent lights, his face revealed nothing. At 34 years old, he had sat in rooms where people begged him, had listened to men twice his age speak the names of their wives and children as bargaining pieces, and he had learned to let those things pass through him the way water passed over stone. No one had ever made him stop, not once. He looked at the woman standing before him, a woman with no home, no profession, nothing with which to threaten him, and nothing with which to tempt him, and she had just asked him a question that no one in his organization would have dared to ask. He remained silent for a long time. Then he reached into his pocket, took out his phone, dialed a number, and raised it to his ear. He didn't turn away. He stood directly in front of her and spoke exactly 4 words into the phone. "Drop the whole thing." Then he ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. June didn't thank him. She watched him for another moment, gave one very small nod, then turned and walked up the ramp out of the garage. She stepped onto Wacker Drive and turned left, away from Halsted Street. She walked directly to the Central District Police Station on 19th Street. Inspector Theodora Vance's office was on the 2nd floor of the Central District Station, at the end of a hallway, with a flickering light no one had bothered to replace. She sat behind a desk buried beneath files, her brown wool coat draped over the back of the chair, the cuffs of her shirt worn thin, and she listened to June speak for 40 minutes without interrupting her once. June told it in order. 11 cases of complications after the hospital switched to a pain medication covered by an exclusive contract, her report to the department head. The disappearance of all 11 records from the system 3 weeks later. The letter she sent to the Illinois State Medical Board. 4 months of waiting. Then the accusation of a dosage error during a shift she hadn't worked, and the suspension order that arrived by mail one March afternoon. She placed the cracked phone on the desk, opened the photo folder, and pushed it toward Vance. Vance examined all 11 images. She studied them slowly, enlarged several sections, and wrote a few lines in her notebook. When she reached the 12th image, she paused longer than she had on any of the others, looked at the signature at the bottom, then raised her eyes to June before speaking. "You know this person." "She trained me for 6 years, June said. Vance didn't ask anything more about that. She pushed the phone back, sat upright, and said plainly what June had feared throughout the entire walk there. "This isn't enough. It wasn't enough 2 years ago, and it still isn't enough now." She tapped the end of her pen against the notebook. "You have 11 screenshots stored on a personal phone. The other side will say 3 things. First, the source can't be authenticated. Second, screenshots can be recreated with any kind of software. Third, you're already in a dispute with them, so you have a motive. Those 3 statements, and the board closes the case in 2 days, exactly the way it did before. June sat without moving. Then what do we need? She asked. Something that didn't pass through your hands, Vance said. We need corroboration. The medical record shows what medication the patient received, what dosage, and at what time. The pharmacy inventory shows which batch left storage, the lot number, which department received it, and on what date. Those 2 things have to match. If the hospital erased 11 medical records but forgot to erase the corresponding pharmacy entries, then the pharmacy records are the evidence. They prove that medication left storage for patients who, according to the system, never existed. She set down the pen. That is the one thing they can't argue away, because it isn't your word. It is their own record-keeping. Where is it? On Hale Meridian's internal servers, Vance said. Central pharmacy, not the medical records system. 2 separate systems, 2 separate departments, 2 separate administrative teams. That is why people forget. She leaned back in the chair and looked at June for a moment. I can request a warrant, but to obtain one, I need probable cause, and the only basis I currently have is 11 images I just told you aren't enough. You see the circle here? June saw it. She remained silent for a long time. Then Vance continued, and her voice changed. You walked here from Halstead Street through the snow in the middle of the night. You didn't call. You didn't make an appointment. You came straight to the station. People only do that when they have just finished making a decision. She picked up the pen again. Where did you just come from, Miss Holloway? June didn't answer immediately. I know someone, she finally said. Vance nodded slowly. Rhys Callahan. The entire room fell silent. In the hallway outside, the broken light flickered twice, then steadied. I have been watching that name longer than you think, Vance said. His father, then him. In 20 years, no one has managed to put a single usable document on a prosecutor's desk. I'm not asking how you know him, and I don't care. She pushed the notebook aside and looked directly at June. I will help you. I will reopen the case. I will go with you to the board, and I will do everything within my authority. But there is one condition. What condition? Whatever he does, you tell me. Who he meets, where he sends people, what orders he gives. Everything. Vance didn't raise her voice or lower it. I'm not telling you to deceive him. I'm not telling you to trap him. I'm only saying that if you sit in his car and hear something, you tell me. June looked down at the 2 hands resting in her lap. She thought about the 3 trucks carrying generators along Halstead Street during the storm. She thought about the invoice with the payer's name left blank. She thought about the 4 words he had spoken into the phone in the underground garage, spoken directly in front of her without turning away. I agree, she said. She signed the paper Vance handed her, and the signature she wrote that day looked nothing like her signature anywhere else. Then she stepped into the hallway, descended the stairs, walked out through the station doors, and stood on the steps beneath the falling snow for a long time before moving on, because there are things people do because they are right, and still feel something inside them break. 3 days later, June told Rhys about the pharmacy records. She kept it brief, explained only the medical details, didn't say how she knew what to look for, and didn't say who had told her. Rhys listened to everything. He didn't ask a single question about the source. He asked only the name of the system, the department that managed it, and the format of the records. Then he said, I can get it. Obtaining the pharmacy inventory records took 9 days and cost more money than Rhys had expected, but that wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was what he discovered while preparing for it. To place someone inside Hale Meridian's system, his people had to construct a legitimate corporate cover, and to build that cover, they first had to pull the records of 4 medical transportation companies in which the Callahan organization held ownership stakes. When the files reached his desk, Rhys noticed something small. 3 of the 4 companies had undergone financial reviews in November, 6 weeks earlier, and all 3 reviews had been conducted by the same person. They had been performed outside the regular schedule, with no written request and no notation in any meeting minutes. Rhys looked at the name listed in the reviewer field and sat motionless for a long time. Warren Hobb was the family attorney, but Hobb wasn't the man who controlled the money. That man was Desmond Kerr, 61 years old, the Callahan family's financial manager since Rhys was in high school, a man who wore bifocals and a gray tie every day of the week, a man who had sat in the second row at Ambrose's funeral and wept quietly through the entire service. For 20 years, not a single dollar belonging to the family had passed through anyone else's hands. Reese didn't summon him to the office. He went downstairs. Desmond Kerr's office was on the 38th floor, behind a wooden door, with a fern inside that he misted every Monday morning. Reese closed the door behind him and placed the review file on the desk. The old man looked at it and didn't ask what it was. That was the first thing that told Reese for certain. "How long?" he asked. Desmond Kerr removed his glasses, folded the arms, and placed them on the desk. His hands trembled slightly. "Since September," he said. "What did you sell?" "Land locations, floor plans, structural records for several buildings around Halsted Street. The electrical and plumbing plans for the red brick building, too." Reese knew which red brick building he meant. He didn't say it aloud. "How much money?" "There was no money." Reese looked at him. "Not a single dollar," Desmond Kerr said. "You can have someone inspect my accounts. Check all of them. Even the one in Indiana that I opened in 1997. There's nothing there." He sat in silence for a moment. Then he opened a drawer, took out an envelope that had already been unsealed, and pushed it across the desk. Reese removed the paper inside. It was a treatment plan printed on the letterhead of a Hale Meridian facility on the north side of the city, naming the patient as Ruth Kerr, 64 years old. Her treatment schedule was 3 sessions a week. In the lower corner, a small line stated that the patient was enrolled in a special assistance program subject to quarterly review. "My wife has kidney disease," Desmond Kerr said. 4 years now. That program is the only thing keeping her on the priority list. Without it, she goes to the end of the waiting line. I don't need to explain to you what the end of that line means. He looked down at his hands. In September, someone came to see me in the parking lot of that facility. He didn't threaten me. He didn't say a single thing that could be recorded and used against him. He only said the assistance program was approaching its review period, that the budget was tighter this year, that the list would have to be shortened. Then he asked where I worked. He already knew. He asked so I could hear myself answer. Reese set the paper down. "You knew I would find out." "I knew," the old man said. "I worked for your father for 20 years. I know what happens afterward." He raised his eyes to Reese, and they were red but dry. "Do whatever you want to me. I'm only asking you not to touch her program. She doesn't know anything. She thinks it's insurance." Reese stood there for a long time. He thought about a sheet of paper folded into quarters inside his breast pocket, about a pen rolling across a metal table in a warehouse by the river, about a man begging to be given any other punishment. Reese had believed he understood that kind of leverage, the softest place inside a person, and he had used it so skillfully that he never needed to raise his voice. He bought people through the futures of those they loved, but he only bought them after they had done something wrong. What sat before him now was different. Prescott Hale didn't need anyone to be guilty. He didn't need to bargain, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to speak a single sentence that could be brought into court. He only needed to hold the failing part of a 64-year-old woman's body while her husband happened to work inside this building. He had built an entire hospital system. And within that system, people's health wasn't something he treated. It was something he held. "Go home," Reese said. Desmond Kerr looked up. "Go home. Don't come to work this week." The old man stood, picked up his glasses with trembling hands, and walked toward the door without daring to ask another question. Reese remained in the office with the fern, lifted the treatment plan, and read it again from beginning to end, and he understood that he had misjudged his opponent from the very first day. The pharmacy inventory records arrived at the warming station on Tuesday morning, printed on paper, 160 pages divided into 2 blue-bound volumes, and carried inside a leather briefcase that one of Reese's men delivered before leaving immediately. They were hidden in Gus's desk at the front of the room, inside a drawer that only one person had opened in 14 years. The warming station was closed during the day. That had been the rule since the day it opened. The doors unlocked at twilight and locked again at dawn. No one admitted during daylight hours, and the 40 people who had slept there the night before had been back on the streets since 7 o'clock that morning, looking for work, applying for assistance, or sitting inside the public library to stay warm. At that hour, only 3 people were inside the 2-story red brick building: June and the 2 daytime caretakers, 71-year-old Elmer Foss, sitting at the front desk, and 68-year-old Doris Whitfield, working in the kitchen. preparing the evening pot of soup. They came shortly before noon. 3 men, entering through the back, cutting the padlock from the yard gate. June was sitting in the corner, comparing the medication lot numbers in the blue volume with the photographs on her cracked phone, and she heard the back door hinge groan before she saw anyone. She closed the file. Elmer Foss rose from the front desk and asked who they were. Everything happened quickly after that. One man shoved the old man aside, sending him crashing into a stack of plastic chairs against the wall, while the other 2 went straight toward the front of the room, toward Gus's desk, moving like men who had already been given directions and knew exactly which drawer to open. June stood and blocked their path. One of the men grabbed her arm and pulled her away. She fought back. The leather briefcase was dragged from the drawer. One of the blue volumes fell to the floor, and the other man bent to retrieve it. Doris ran out of the kitchen and screamed. There was a crash near the back door, the sound of running feet, and then 2 of the men headed outside with the briefcase in their hands. The third followed last, but on his way out, he turned into the hallway leading down to the boiler room. He was inside for less than a minute. When he came out, he wasn't carrying anything. June didn't see what he had done. She was kneeling beside Elmer Foss when she heard the back door slam, and immediately afterward, a low, hollow gurgle rose from beneath the floor, a sound she had heard only once before in her life, during a night shift at the hospital when the basement steam system malfunctioned. Smoke began pushing through the gaps around the hallway door before she had time to stand. Outside, Reese Callahan's car had just turned onto Halstead Street. He had come to collect the pharmacy records and move them somewhere safer for duplication, and he was running about 10 minutes late because of an accident at the intersection on Roosevelt Street. From inside the car, he saw 2 men running through the back gate, one of them clutching the leather briefcase against his chest, while a white van waited at the mouth of the alley with its engine running. He also saw the smoke. It was only a thin thread creeping upward from the southern basement window, so faint that his driver hadn't noticed it. Reese watched the white van begin moving north. His driver had already shifted gears and was waiting for the order, and there were 3 of Reese's men inside the car, while the van ahead was moving slowly through the accumulated snow, carrying all 160 pages, the thing he had spent 9 days and a great deal of money obtaining, the only thing in the world that could give a woman her name back. He opened the car door and stepped out. "Call the fire department," he said. Then he ran toward the red brick building. Inside, June had already begun working. When the smoke appeared, she didn't scream, didn't run in circles, didn't search for a fire extinguisher. She did what had been placed inside her mind when she was 21 years old and drilled into her 4 times a year for 6 years. She identified the nearest exit that remained clear of smoke. She counted the people. 3 people inside the building, 1 unable to walk without assistance. She went for Doris first, because Doris could still move on her own, guided her through the front door, pointed toward the sidewalk across the street, and told her to stand there and not go anywhere. Then she went back inside. The smoke had thickened across the upper half of the room, and she moved beneath it in a crouch, one hand holding a wet cloth over her nose. Elmer Foss was still leaning against the stack of plastic chairs, unable to stand because of his hip. June didn't try to lift him to his feet. She pulled down one of the plastic chairs, helped him sit in it, then gripped the chair by both legs and dragged it backward across the concrete floor, step by step, toward the front door, because plastic slid across the concrete more easily than anything else in the room. By the time she reached the entrance, Reese was already there. He took the chair from her hands, carried the old man onto the sidewalk in 3 strides, and set him down. Then he turned and saw June running back inside. He called her name. She didn't stop. She went straight to the desk at the front of the room, dropped to her knees, opened the lowest drawer, and pulled out the gray, hard-bound ledger. She shoved it inside her coat, holding it tightly against herself with one arm, then turned toward the exit. By then, the smoke had descended to chest level. Reese met her in the middle of the room, and he didn't say anything. He only wrapped one arm around her shoulders and guided her outside. The fire trucks arrived 11 minutes later. The flames consumed only the boiler room and part of the basement corridor, while the rest of the building suffered damage from smoke and water. No one was seriously injured. 4 people stood on the opposite sidewalk of Halstead Street in the cold and watched the smoke rise. An elderly woman still wearing her apron, an old man seated in a plastic chair, a woman holding a hardbound ledger beneath her coat, and a man wearing an unbuttoned gray wool coat. The white van had left the city long before then. The 160 pages inside the leather briefcase were never found again. They found Merrick Lowe after 4 days, and it wasn't difficult, because he hadn't tried to hide. He still ate lunch at the same restaurant on Rush Street, still parked his silver 2-door car in the same place, and still returned to his rented apartment in River North at the same hour. He was brought to an empty room on the 3rd floor of an abandoned office building the Callahan organization had controlled for years, and inside that room there was only a folding table, 2 chairs, and a window facing the brick wall of the neighboring building. No one tied him up. No one touched him. They simply invited him to sit, closed the door, and left him alone for about half an hour before Reese entered. Reese pulled out the remaining chair and sat across from him. He brought nothing with him. No documents, no phone placed on the table, nothing that could be used to apply pressure. "Your father is Gerald Lowe," he said. "His office is on the 27th floor of the building on LaSalle Street. He specializes in corporate mergers. You have an older brother working in Boston and a younger sister in Portland, and neither of them has spoken to you since your sister's wedding." Merrick said nothing. "You owe 3 people," Reese continued. "The first is in Bridgeport. That debt is small. You can pay it. The second is a casino on Cicero Avenue. That debt is larger. As for the third, I don't think you even know his real name, and that is the debt your father has already paid for you twice, most recently in August of last year." He paused. "After that, he told you there wouldn't be a third time. Isn't that right?" Merrick Lowe swallowed. His index finger began tapping against the folding table. Tap, tap, steady, neither fast nor slow, each beat separated by the same amount of time. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "You do," Reese said. "I want to ask about the night at the train station on Halsted Street." The finger kept tapping. Tap, tap. "I use that station all the time," Merrick said, and his voice rose half a note. "I have friends in that neighborhood. You don't have any friends in that neighborhood." Tap, tap. Reese remained still, and in the silence, the rhythm continued to sound through the empty room, perfectly even, never speeding up when Merrick became nervous, never slowing when he stopped speaking. Reese looked down at his hand. He watched the index finger rise and fall, and he counted 3 beats, then 4, then 5. Then he looked up. "Who taught you that?" he asked. Merrick froze. His hand went rigid against the table. "What?" "That rhythm. You just tapped 14 times. Merrick looked down at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else. "No one taught me anything," he said, but the blood had already drained from his face. "There was a lookout that night," Reese said. "The man leaning against the steel column, tapping the beer bottle. 47 times. He wasn't drunk. It was a signal. There was a 5th man somewhere outside the station listening to the tapping, so he would know everything was still under control." He leaned back in the chair. "You tap too. Same rhythm. People turn it into a habit when they use it often enough." Merrick didn't answer. "I'm asking one last time," Reese said, and his voice didn't rise. "What did you go down there to do that night?" The room remained silent for a long time. Outside the window, a bird landed on the edge of the brick wall, then flew away. "We were paid to find out whether she was still carrying anything," Merrick said. "That was all. We weren't supposed to touch her. We weren't supposed to take anything unless we found documents. We were told to search everything she had and report back." He drew in a breath. "We reported that there was nothing. Just a toothbrush, some gauze, and a broken phone." Reese remained still. "Who paid you?" "I never met anyone face to face. The money went into an account, and the messages were deleted." He lowered his eyes. "But I kept the account number the transfer came from. I kept it because I didn't trust them." Reese stood. He opened the door and told the person outside to bring in paper, a pen, and a recorder. Then he turned back toward Merrick Lowe. "You will write down everything. Names, dates, amounts, the account number, and the names of the other 3 men. When you finish, you will read it all into the recorder." "And then what?" Merrick asked. His voice had grown smaller. "What are you going to do to me?" "Nothing," Reese said. "You are going to say all of it again to Inspector Vance at the Central District Station, this afternoon." Merrick's head snapped up. "You're handing me over to the police?" Reese had already reached the door. He stopped with one hand on the handle, but he didn't turn around. "Your statement only matters if it becomes part of an official record," he said. "Whatever I do to you in this room won't help anyone." Then he opened the door and walked out. The hearing opened on a late January morning, on the 9th floor of a state administrative building on Randolph Street. Inside a room with 7 chairs arranged in an arc and a small table below them for the petitioner, June arrived an hour early and sat waiting in the hallway. She wore the white shirt Doris Whitfield had washed and pressed for her in the kitchen at St. Bridget's Church, and pinned to her chest was the white plastic name badge with blue lettering, its surface still marked by a deep scratch running diagonally through the first letter. She had no attorney. She had done the calculations and knew she couldn't afford one, while Vance was permitted to sit only in the observer's row because no criminal charges had yet been filed. Across the room, 3 people in suits sat in a single row, and the man in the middle was Hale Meridian Health's chief legal counsel, a silver-haired attorney named Calvin Ridge, who had brought 2 briefcases and an assistant to take notes. The chair of the board called June's name and invited her to present her case. She stood. She spoke without holding any papers. She began with November 19th of that year, during the night shift in the intensive care unit at Hale Meridian St. Anne Hospital, when the hospital transferred all postoperative pain management orders to a new medication covered by an exclusive supply contract. She stated the active ingredient, the formulation, and the initial dosage under the newly issued protocol. Then she went through the cases, one by one. The first patient, male, 67 years old. The medical record number she recited from memory, the time the order was received, the time the change in respiratory measurements was recorded, and the number of minutes between those 2 points. The second patient. The third. She went through all 11 cases without stumbling, without mistaking a single number, and her voice remained steady from beginning to end. The entire room was silent. One board member stopped writing in order to listen. By the 9th case, the woman seated at the far right removed her glasses and watched June closely. When June finished the clinical portion, she continued with the report she had made to the department director on December 11th, and how 3 weeks later she opened the system and found that all 11 record numbers returned the result that no such record existed. She explained that she had photographed each record screen during the night shifts before that, not because she suspected anyone, but because she had a habit of preserving unusual cases so she could compare them later. Then she placed the cracked phone on the table, opened the photo folder, and the board secretary brought over a projector. The 11 images appeared one after another on the white wall behind the row of chairs. The edges were pixelated. The photographs were taken at an angle, and some were washed out by the glare of the ceiling lights in the nurse's station. But the numbers were legible. The chair invited the interested party to respond. Calvin Ridge stood, and he spoke for less than 6 minutes. He didn't dispute a single number. He didn't say June was wrong. He raised only 3 points. First, the images that had just been projected were screenshots taken from a personal device, without digital signatures and without timestamps authenticated by the system. And under the board's guidelines for electronic evidence, documents of that kind couldn't serve as independent grounds for action. Second, there was no corroborating documentation from the medical facility for comparison. No original patient records, no pharmaceutical dispensing logs, no system audit logs, and without corroboration, the board had no basis for determining whether the images reflected genuine data or data that had been created. Third, the petitioner's license had already been revoked, and she remained involved in an unresolved legal dispute with the facility, creating a clear motive that the board needed to consider when evaluating her credibility. He thanked the board and sat down. No one asked him a single question. The chair turned to June and asked whether she had any corroborating documentation. June stood there. She thought about a leather briefcase holding 2 blue-bound volumes, 160 pages of paper, and a white van traveling north along Halstead Street, while smoke crept from the basement window. "No," she said. "I don't." The board recessed for 15 minutes to deliberate. They returned after 11. The chair read the decision in the level voice of someone who had read hundreds of decisions just like it. The board acknowledged the seriousness of the petitioner's presentation. The board acknowledged that the clinical information she provided was internally consistent. However, because there was no corroborating documentation from the medical facility, and because the electronic evidence submitted didn't meet the required standard of authentication, the board found no qualifying new grounds to reopen the disciplinary case. The petition was denied. The revocation of her license would remain in effect. The petitioner was informed of her right to appeal within 30 days. The gavel struck the table once. People began gathering their papers. Calvin Ridge closed his briefcases, said something to his assistant, and all 3 people in that row stood and walked toward the door. The secretary switched off the projector, and the white wall behind the chairs became nothing more than a white wall again. June lifted the phone from the table, slipped it into her coat pocket, and stepped into the hallway. She walked a few paces before sitting on the wooden bench against the wall. The 9th floor corridor was long and brightly lit, noon sunlight pouring through the windows at the far end, while the sound of footsteps moved somewhere behind her. June sat with her back straight and both hands resting on her thighs. She looked down at them. They were trembling, both of them, and she pressed them together, but they still wouldn't stop. Inside the room, people were placing files back into their briefcases, and one board member had already risen to put on a coat. The door opened. No one had knocked. The person who entered was a woman in her 60s, with short silver hair, wearing a charcoal wool coat, and holding a thick brown envelope against her chest with both hands. She stopped in the doorway and looked around the room once, and when she saw that the small table below the board was already empty, she calmly asked whether the hearing had ended. The chair of the board said that it had. She stepped fully into the room. "My name is Margaret Osler," she said. "I am the former director of intensive care at Hale Meridian St. Anne Hospital. I would like to give a statement for the record." Calvin Ridge had already reached the doorway. He stopped. In the hallway, June heard a chair scrape across the floor, and someone speak more loudly than usual. She looked up. The door to the hearing room was still open, and through it, she saw the back of the charcoal wool coat she had watched every morning during shift change for 6 years, the posture leaning slightly to the left, because the woman had suffered from knee pain for a long time. June rose from the bench and didn't remember how she entered the room. Inside, Margaret Osler was placing the brown envelope on the table. She opened it and removed the documents one bundle at a time. They weren't reprinted copies. They weren't photographs. They were dot matrix records on continuous form paper, with the perforated holes still running along both sides, the kind of paper the hospital pharmacy had used for daily dispensing reports, before the system moved entirely to electronic storage. Each bundle was stapled at the corner, carried the overlapping seal of the pharmacy department, and on the final page of each bundle was the original signature of the pharmacist on duty and a slightly blurred round purple stamp. "These are the pharmaceutical dispensing records from the central pharmacy," she said, "from November 19th through December 8th of that year. Paper records, signed and stamped. 11 medication batches, with the lot numbers, dispensing dates, receiving departments, and corresponding patient names clearly recorded." The chair of the board sat down again. "Where did you obtain these documents?" "I kept them," Osler said, "for 2 years." The entire room fell silent. The pharmacy printed 2 copies every day. One was stored electronically, and 1 paper copy was sent to the department. When the 11 medical records were removed from the system, the electronic pharmacy records were removed as well, but the paper copies had already been inside a cabinet in my department. She placed one hand on the stack of documents. "I took them home that night. I kept them in a safe. I knew exactly what I was holding." Calvin Ridge stepped back into the room and began talking about procedure, about the documents not having been authenticated, about the hearing already being closed. Margaret Osler didn't look at him. She turned toward the chair of the board and continued, "I would also like one more fact entered into the record." She removed the final sheet from the envelope. It was a copy of the disciplinary decision, the same document June had photographed and kept inside her cracked phone for 2 years. "The confirming signature of the direct supervisor on the second line is mine. I signed it on March 17th. Before signing it, I read the file, and I knew the accusation in it was false. I knew June Holloway hadn't been present for the shift on February 14th. I had the department schedule, and I was the person who had made it." She placed the document beside the pharmacy records. "I signed because someone had come to see me 2 weeks earlier. My daughter was 26 years old and receiving dialysis 3 times a week at a Hale Meridian facility. The man didn't threaten me. He only spoke to me about the upcoming review of the priority list." She paused. "I signed. That was my choice, and I don't blame anyone else for it." No one in the room said anything. "I signed that document," Margaret Osler said. "Today, I came here to sign this one." Then she picked up the pen and signed the statement the board secretary had just placed before her, and her hand didn't tremble. June stood at the back of the room near the door. When Osler turned around, the 2 women looked at each other across a distance of more than 10 paces. Neither of them stepped forward. Neither of them spoke. The older woman gave one very small nod, then bent down, gathered the empty envelope, and walked toward the door. She passed June without stopping. Everything afterward proceeded according to formal procedure. The board reopened the case within 9 days, compared the pharmacy records with the 11 photographs, and the 2 sets of data matched down to every lot number. The revocation of June Holloway's license was overturned. Her name was removed from the National Registry, and the suspension record was completely erased from the system. During the same proceeding, the board opened disciplinary action against Margaret Osler for falsely certifying information in a disciplinary file. And after 41 years in medicine, her professional license was permanently revoked. She didn't appeal. 2 weeks later, her daughter received a letter stating that the Hale Meridian Facility's Special Assistance Program had completed its review and that her name was no longer on the list. 3 days after that, she received a call from the University Hospital's dialysis center on the west side of the city, informing her that she had been accepted into its long-term treatment program, 3 sessions a week, beginning Monday. The caller said the entire cost had been covered by a private foundation. She asked for the foundation's name. The person on the other end gave a name she had never heard before, and added that under the foundation's rules, the identity of the donor couldn't be disclosed. Inspector Theodora Vance came to see Reese Callahan one February afternoon at the coffee shop on the corner of Adams Street, without an appointment. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, and placed her notebook on the table without opening it. Merrick Lowe's statement led to 2 more people, she said. The account number led to a shell company in Nevada. The shell company led to an internal payment from Hale Meridian. It isn't enough to indict Prescott Hale, but it is enough to open a case. Reese nodded once. You handed him over to me instead of dealing with him yourself, Vance said. You also called off whatever you were planning to do to Hale. I know about both. She lifted her coffee cup, then set it down again without drinking. But I'm not sitting here to thank you. He didn't respond. You did the right thing once, she said. That doesn't erase the 10 years before it. It doesn't erase your father. It doesn't erase 3,200 apartments. And it doesn't erase what happened in those warehouses by the river that I haven't been able to prove. She looked directly into his eyes. I will still come after you. As long as I am doing this job, I will keep coming after you. Reese remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded a second time, more slowly than before. I know, he said. Vance stood, picked up her notebook, and walked out without saying anything else. June arrived about half an hour later. She was wearing a new coat, the first one she had owned in 2 years without a single mended seam across the shoulder, and she sat in the same chair Vance had just left. She didn't waste time. There is something I have to tell you, she said. The night I left the garage, I went to see Inspector Vance. She agreed to help me on one condition. I had to tell her everything you did, who you met, where you sent people, what orders you gave. She placed both hands on the table. I told her. All this time, I even signed an agreement. Reese looked at her. His expression didn't change. He didn't shift in his seat, and he didn't put down his cup. I knew from the beginning, he said. June straightened. You knew? It takes 40 minutes to walk from here to the Central District Station, he said. The snow was deep that night. I had someone in a car 2 blocks behind you. He took a sip of coffee. You entered the station shortly before 10 o'clock and came out close to midnight. No one spends 2 hours inside a police station asking for directions. June didn't know what to say. Then why did you still get the pharmacy records? Reese set down the cup. Because you needed them, he said. By the end of May, the 2-story red brick building on Halstead Street opened its doors again, and the wooden sign above the main entrance no longer read Public Warming Station. It read Reynolds House. Inside, the old boiler room had been rebuilt into a sterilization area. The rows of beds that once lined the walls had become 4 examination bays divided by blue curtains, and at the front of the room, in the exact place where Gus Reynolds had always kept his plastic chair, stood the patient reception desk. The clinic charged no fees. People came from all 3 surrounding blocks, carrying handwritten appointment slips and waiting on orange plastic chairs purchased from a closed clinic on the south side. June Holloway was the head nurse. She wore a white coat, her hair neatly tied back, and pinned to her chest was a white plastic name badge with blue lettering, its surface marked by a deep scratch running diagonally through the first letter. They had ordered a new badge for her during the very first week. It was still inside a drawer, unopened. That Saturday morning was sunny, the kind of late spring sunlight that arrived slowly in Chicago, but once it came, it filled everything, pouring through the second-floor window and falling across the wooden floor in long golden bands. In the backyard, neighborhood families had brought their children to play because the clinic was offering routine pediatric health examinations that day. The children ran around the newly planted maple tree, the older ones chasing the younger ones, one child crying out with delight after being measured and discovering that he had grown taller since the last visit, and their laughter carried all the way to the second-floor window where June stood. In the lobby, leaning against the wall to the right of the main entrance, was a large bronze plaque that had not yet been mounted. June sat before it with the gray, hardbound ledger open on her lap, checking every line and reading each name aloud for the engraver to copy. 412 names. She read slowly, pronounced every word clearly, and paused for one beat after each name. At noon, she stepped outside and stood on the front steps to ease the ache in her back. Across the street, beneath the shadow of a lamppost, stood a man. His gray wool coat was draped over one arm because the weather had grown warm. He stood there about 8 yards from the steps, and he didn't cross the street. June saw him. He saw her too. They remained that way for a while the sound of children still drifted from the backyard, and neither of them moved closer. Then he walked past, set a steaming paper cup of coffee on the lowest step, and continued toward the elevated train station without looking back. June walked down, bent over, and lifted the cup with both hands. It was still warm. There are things people lose in life and still go on living. Lose a home, and they can rent another. Lose a job, and they can find different work. Lose money, and they can begin again. But when someone's name is taken from them, when they are erased from the records that say they once existed, that they once did something for someone, that kind of poverty can't be repaid with money. And restoring a person's name is something no amount of power can buy. Only respect can do it. Only someone willing to stand up and speak the truth can do it, even when the price is themselves. If this story touched you, please leave a like, share it with the person who came to mind as you listened, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue hearing compelling stories together every day. How did you feel about the story of June and Reese? And what would you have chosen if you had been in June's place at the moment she knelt on that concrete floor that night? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. We truly hope to hear what is in the deepest part of your hearts. We wish everyone listening today abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day to come. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.